everyone. Welcome to our first online version of our class. Again, I want to say that I'm really sorry that we won't meet again in person this semester. I hope I see you all very soon. Please consider taking another class next semester. Um, I really appreciated this class and the people who are in this class. You're all so intelligent and promising and thoughtful and analytical, and I am really sorry that we're not going to be able to meet again, but I really hope to see you all in class in the future. So you have an exam on Thursday. I sent an email about that exam. It's short answer. I'm going to post it on Thursday, but you'll have a day to finish it. And the exam is going to be on the three regions we've been going over in this section. So Russia, Sub-Saharan Africa, and North Africa, Southwest Asia. And basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to post a question or two about each of those regions. And you're going to have to answer those questions in a short answer, like a paragraph. Okay, so starting us off today, we were talking about North Africa, Southwest Asia the other day. We talked about the hydraulic civilization. We talked about the origin of civilization there. We started talking about Islam, and I was trying to lay the foundation of the culture of this area. And Islam has a huge part in the foundation of the culture of this area. I didn't actually get into Islam the other day. I had started talking about Abraham, and Abraham is the patriarch to the religions Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. So we're going to understand a little bit about Islam today. We're going to talk about the conflict in this area, and we are going to talk about gender in this area, and a little bit about, and we're going to talk about Israel. And I've posted videos for this region. It's really important to me and to your midterm on Thursday that you watch these videos. This is an area, like I've said in class before, that is very complex, and it's a place that we have a single narrative for. That single narrative is violence and craziness, and I really want us to understand this area at least a little bit. So watching those videos, I posted a video about Syria, I posted a video about Israel and Palestine. There's a video about the Cold War that's been happening in Southwest Asia since the Iranian Revolution in 1977, 1979, sorry. And so I really want you to watch those in order to understand this region a little bit more. Okay, so like I said, we're talking Islam, we're talking Israel, we're talking conflict. Two quotes for you. To overcome evil with good is evil. To resist evil by evil is evil. I wanted to include this quote because this is Muhammad, peace be upon him, the Muhammad that is very important to Islam. And if you don't know why he's important, you'll know in a little bit. But I wanted to post this quote in particular because people think of Islam as being somehow a religion of crazy people who hate freedom and America and other stuff like that. But that's not Islam at all. And this, the founder of the religion, Muhammad, the last prophet in terms of Islam, was a person who said things like this. So there you go. And then I ask you, Lord, why you enlighten me without the enlightenment of all my folks. He said, because I set myself on a quest for truth, and he was there to quench my thirst. That is a quote from a song, but it is a great quote when trying to understand anything, whether it's religion, whether it's conflict, whether it's gender, whatever. So we are talking North Africa, Southwest Asia, and don't worry, I have another map with North Africa, but just to really look at the view of Southwest Asia in contrast to the rest of Asia. And again, Europe gets cut off in this part of Asia. But just so you get an idea of where Southwest Asia is, and if you remember the other day, I spent a lot of time talking about how the location of Southwest Asia has a lot to do with its history. So today, the question is oil. And we'll talk about oil in a little bit. But when Europe and Africa and East Asia were trading along the Silk Road, this is the area that's right in between. This is the transport, right? This is the Silk Road. And so if you didn't have a lot to trade, which Europe did not have a lot to trade, and later in class, we'll talk about how, because they didn't have a lot to trade, places like Britain colonize South Asia, places like, or Britain again, steals tea. You know, they really wanted the tea from China, and they sent in an agronomist and had that person steal tea from this area and transplant it to South Asia and start to grow it there. And then they colonized South Asia so that they could dominate the growth of that tea. So Europe really didn't have a whole lot to trade, and they wanted what East Asia had, and they wanted what Africa had. And so when you don't have a lot to trade, you're in a trade deficit. And the way they made up for this was by controlling places like Istanbul, controlling the Mediterranean coast right along here, controlling the Hindu Kush right in here, because this is the pass. This is the kind of flattest way you can get into East Asia. You know, if you go this way, you're basically going to hit the peak of the Himalayas. And this wasn't the only way. Like a lot of people made their way down this way and they kind of hopped over here and went around. But this was a central way. And so if you controlled this pass, or if you controlled this, or if you controlled this, then you controlled trade. And if you remember the other day, I showed a map, an interactive map, and I'm going to post that on Canvas, that showed how many different people have tried to control this part of the world for a very long period of time. If they weren't trying to control this, they were trying to control this. And I want you to watch that and look at that interactive map again and see how important, especially right here, was. And that's because that was trade. So we know that a big part of the history of this region of the world has to do with controlling trade. So what was the reaction of the people in this area? We're going to get to that in just a minute, but I want to remind you from the other day, I talked about how for a long time, the economy of this area, besides being based on who controlled it with trade, was basically nomadic people who ferried you across Southwest Asia. So wherever you were coming from, let's say that you were coming from the Great Zimbabwe down here, you would make your way up, you would have gone through the East African Rift, you would have made your way up, and now as you're making your way across the Arabian Peninsula, there would have been groups of people who would have taken you from point to point, showed you the clean water, showed you the safe way to go. They would have protected you, and you would have made your way along here. So the economy of this area for a very long time was basically ferrying people through the desert. Now remember, this is the origin of civilization. And when civilization started here in Mesopotamia, the climate was very different. The fluvial geography was different, the soil was different. So for a long time, this was an area that thrived in agriculture and in trade, but the climate changed. The ice sheet that covered this part of the world retreated, and Europe became Europe, and Southwest Asia became a much drier place. So with the center of civilization moving away from Southwest Asia, a lot of the economies here focused on how to control small pieces of land and how to ensure safe passage of people through those small pieces of land. That doesn't mean that there weren't gigantic civilizations here still. When Europe was in the Middle Ages, this part of the world was having a renaissance. So that doesn't mean that there weren't places here that were urban centers that had developed civilizations, art, math, like this at one point this was the focus of the intellectual and artistic world. But if we're looking at places like the Arabian Peninsula, you would have had to be people who controlled the land and basically controlled like one serious part of the economy, like getting people across the Arabian Peninsula. Okay, So we know from the other day that this is the development of agriculture, the beginning of civilization and of the culture of the world. Today, still ideas that come from here are dominant parts of our culture. We know that when this ice sheet retreated, the economy here had to change. And now, instead of controlling land, it became about controlling water. That's the idea of the hydrologic or the hydraulic civilization that we were talking about the other day. That's why I brought Mad Max up the other day. Okay, so not that the world looked like Mad Max at that time, but it became about controlling water instead of controlling land because the water was drying up. Okay, so then we started talking about Abraham. We started to talk about Abraham, who, just to remind you, Abraham was the patriarch of these three religions. And these three religions aren't the only religions in the world, but they are major religions in the world when it comes to population. Not so much this one. There's only 15 million Jews in the world, but there are 2.3 billion Christians and there are 1.6 billion Islamic people in the world, or Muslims in the world. The difference between those two terms, by the way, Islam is the religion, Muslim is the person. So there are 1.6 billion Muslims in the world, and there are 2.3 billion Christians in the world. So even though these aren't the only religions in the world, and even though they're not necessarily the faith of the people who are listening to this lecture right now, they're still very important because they're going to make a big difference in culture. And even if we don't take part in these religions, if they set the cultural tone of an area, it's important to at least understand them if we want to understand that culture. So if you remember the other day, I talked about how Abraham, this is Abraham, was a sheep herder, and he would have been in Canaan. So he would have been around here, and he was a prophet, which means that he spoke to God, and God heard him, and he heard God directly. And God told him, okay, go over here, Israel. This is your land. I promise this land to you and all your descendants. Now, at the time, you would have had, like I said the other day, just a reminder, you would have had religion all over the world, but it would have been polytheist. It would have had many gods. I've said this before, but just to remind you, having many gods did a whole lot for you. It explained natural phenomena, like if there was a storm or something like that, and it helped us balance with nature. One of our oldest issues as humans is how do we get enough from the earth to feed ourselves and to survive without overtaxing the earth? And one of the ways that we figured out how to balance getting enough from the earth without drying out the soil or using the water or something like that is if we have to share the earth with all kinds of other gods, spiritual entities, fairies, pixies, wherever you are in the world. If you remember when we talked about Europe, the pagan religion here in Europe, there were all these other things in the spiritual world. And basically, it kept people from cutting down all the trees. And an unintended consequence of Christianity coming into Southwest Asia was that this monotheist religion that basically turned the world from being a place that we share with all these spiritual entities to a place that we're the stewards of, that we're supposed to dominate and protect. What that did is it allowed us to cut down all the trees. Again, it was an unintended consequence. In no way am I saying that that's what Jesus intended to do. But it's very important to understand how religion affects culture because it often has these kinds of consequences, like this is our land, God gave it to us, so we can use it as we please. And the consequence of that is we lose all of our trees. Look at that, I rhymed. Okay, so Abraham, back in the day, would have lived in a polytheist world. So the idea of one God talking just to him, well, first of all, he didn't think that that God was the only God that existed. He just thought it was the only God for him and his people, for one. That's important. Another important part is what he was doing. And again, I'm not making a judgment on whether he was actually talking to God or not, but just speaking from like a cultural perspective. What he was doing was basically ensuring resources for his clan. At the time, people would have been tightly knit in these small clans, and their survival, I mean, just look at these surroundings. Their survival would have had to do with how many sheep they could raise, how much of the land they could control, and what they could get from the land. So, giving yourself the edge of, I have one God, and that God has given me, sorry, this part of the world as my promised land, well, that was a pretty big deal. And by the way, Abraham wasn't poor. He wasn't a poor farmer who was like, I know how to get wealthy. I'll just say, God gave me the world. Um, we, like I said, we're not going to make a judgment call on what he was doing, but essentially what he did was he ensured that his clan and all of his descendants would have would have the right to land because of their relationship with their God. So that's the idea of being chosen. So Abraham was, like most people at the time, married to multiple women. Now, Abraham, being the patriarch, was married to Sarah, and he was sort of married to Hagar. And the reason that I say sort of is depending on who you're talking to in the world, he wasn't married to her, he was married to her. This is the system of marriage back in the day. Today, we think about marriage as being something that is all about love and all about, personal commitment and stuff like that. But back in the day, marriage was about inheritance, it was about creating patriarchal lines that gave you access to resources, that gave you access to laborers, basically children. And many children would have been more hands on a farm when you have to collect water, when you have to collect all of your energy through firewood and through dung and stuff like that. It's very important that you have plenty of laborers. So, so the whole idea of marriage had to do with ensuring your inheritance, basically knowing that the children who were coming out of Sarah were Abraham's. So it's not so important that Abraham only had sex with one person. It was important that Sarah only had sex with one person. That way we know that all the children that she's giving birth to are part of Abraham's line. So if that doesn't make sense, it's basically in it's basically the beginning of gender roles. And the idea that women aren't supposed to have sex with a lot of people and men are. So Hagar would have also been his quote unquote wife, or at least she would have been a woman who was only in. So if we take it to marriage terms in those times, Hagar was a woman who was only allowed to have sex with Abraham, but she didn't have the same status as Sarah. And the difference here is the idea of a bride price and a dowry. If you've never heard of these terms before, a bride price was a price that the husband, the person who wanted to marry this woman, paid for her. And the dowry is what she brought with her. It's what her dad gave her to take into her marriage. Now, if her dad could be wealthy, her dad could be a landowner, but if her mom was a wife, then that wife's daughter, so Sarah's mom would have been a wife, that wife's daughter got a dowry. So she got a collection of things she took into the marriage. Hagar, her dad could have been wealthy, but her mom was the same status as her, meaning not a wife, but what's sometimes called a handmaiden, or other times is called a concubine. She was basically married to Abraham in the same sense that she was only allowed to have sex with Abraham, and her children were understood to be Abraham's children, but she didn't have the same rights, meaning that her kids weren't going to inherit anything or the same amount that Sarah's kids were going to inherit. This is all important. So Hagar was essentially the same when it comes to like her role. She was still basically like, if you want to think about marriage as a contract, they were all contracted to Abraham, but she didn't have the same money coming with her. So what this is a difference of status. Basically, the wife was a person who had money that came into the marriage, and the concubine or the handmaiden didn't have any money that came into the marriage, which meant that her kids weren't going to get the same inheritance. Okay, so when Sarah and Abraham are married. Sarah can't have children. And that's a really big deal because that's basically what you brought to a marriage was your labor and your ability to create heirs. So because Abraham was a prophet and he spoke with God, he God kept telling him, "Don't worry, Sarah's going to have children eventually," and just to have faith. And meanwhile, Abraham had a son with Hagar, his other wife, or his concubine, or his handmaiden. And her son is Ishmael. And Ishmael is important because this is the story that Islamic people follow. So, Islamic people, Jewish people, and Christians, they all have this story of Abraham as the patriarch. Some of them include the story of Hagar. Most of them focus on Sarah, but if you're Islamic, you know the story of Hagar. If you're Jewish, you know the story of Hagar, but the stories are very different. In Judaism, Hagar is seen as sort of like a person who was trying to steal something from Sarah, whereas in Islam, Hagar was seen as the woman who was wronged by Abraham and by Sarah. Not so much by Abraham, there's more of a focus on Sarah. Anyway, so, so Hagar gives birth to Ishmael, and after a little while after, Sarah gets pregnant with Isaac, and after Sarah has Isaac, what happens is Sarah basically is worried that the older son is going to claim rights or something to land and inheritance, so she gets kicked out. And when she gets kicked out, she goes and she wanders the wilderness. And by the wilderness, we're talking about the Arabian Peninsula. We're talking about this. She goes and wanders around in this. Now, I'm making such a big point out of this whole origin story because it is very, very important in understanding the culture of this part of the world today. So please bear with me. Okay, so Hagar is sent out into the wilderness. And what happens is she survives because God intervenes. So I'm going to come back to that in a minute. I'm going to come back to that as I talk about Islam. But now you know the foundation of three major religions, and you can kind of see the dynamic of what happens between this would be like the Jewish sect, and this over here would be the beginning of Islam. And if you know about Christianity, Christianity comes out of Judaism. Basically, Judaism happens, and then several thousand years later, Jesus is born. He is a Jew, and he begins the faith of Christianity. So most people in the Christian and Jewish world know this story, but they don't so much know this story. And knowing this story is super important if we want to understand Southwest Asia. Okay, so I'll come back to Hagar in just a minute. So Islam begins as a religion after Christianity. So it has its origins in Judaism, but the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is the prophet who comes along in about 500 years after Jesus. So Abraham happens, and then a couple thousand years later, Moses happens. Moses is the person who actually like founds the formal religion of Judaism, and then about 2,000 years or 3,000 years after that, along comes Jesus. Jesus is the founder of Christianity, and then about 500 years after that, you have Muhammad. Now, Muhammad is an interesting person for a whole lot of reasons, besides that he founds this major religion. He was a merchant. He would have been illiterate, so he wouldn't have been able to read. And he was in a cave right around here, and he was meditating, he was praying, and he would have been part of, so while Judaism goes off and kind of like has its own branch coming off of Abraham. So Abraham and Sarah, they have Isaac. Isaac has Jacob. Jacob has 4 wives, and with those 4 wives, he has 12 sons. Those 4 wives, I don't want to ignore them, like ignoring their names, but they're Leah, Rachel, Zilpah, and Bilhah. I just want to say their names, but you don't need to remember them. Those are the people that go and like those are the branches of the Jewish family, if that makes sense. But the people who come from Ishmael and from Hagar, they recognize themselves as branches of this family as well. If you know anything about Judaism, you know that it's matrilineal, meaning that Jewish people are Jewish because their mothers are Jewish. That's because of this. That's because of this divide. That doesn't mean that they're matriarchal. A lot of people think they're matriarchal, but they're matrilineal, meaning that meaning that you trace your heritage in Judaism through this woman as a way of separating out this person's heritage. Does that make sense? So it was a way of basically separating this group from this group as chosen, not chosen. All right. So, Muhammad, much later, would have seen himself as related to Abraham, but he would have been part of a whole different group of people by then, not Jewish and not Christian. So he's meditating, he's praying, and as far as the story goes, Gabriel, that's an angel, comes and talks to him, and over the next 23 years tells him the story that becomes the Quran. So tells him the story of Ishmael, tells him the story of Hagar, tells him the story of God, the beginning of the universe, all the things that are the foundation of the Quran. That's the holy book in Islam. So one of the reasons that that is a big deal is because this man is illiterate. He can't read. And for the next 23 years after the angel Gabriel appears to him, he writes what is often considered as one of the best books ever written. So the Quran in Southwest Asia is thought of as one of the best books ever written in Arabic and around the world. It's a holy book, yes, but there's people who can read it objectively and still see that it's a well-written book, if that makes sense. Okay, so Islam begins to spread. Now, Islam, like Christianity and like Judaism, is monotheist. There's one God. But unlike Judaism, which you can only be in if you're born into it, like Christianity, is what we call a universalizing religion, meaning that it's a religion that tries to appeal to everyone and tries to convert people. And this is a game changer in the world, because before, under Abraham, it would have been a way to create social identity in small clans. But now, under Christianity and Islam, it's a way to create like an entire regional force. If you can be part of this same way of thinking, whether it's Christianity or whether it's Islam, now you have increased the numbers of people who are part of your culture. And as trade expands, as transportation expands, think about it. Back when Abraham was starting here, having just a little clan identity would have given you dominance in this area. But by the time Jesus and Muhammad come along, and I'm not saying that this is what they intended, but having a universalizing religion that you can now spread over entire gigantic regions, well, that's a real powerful force. So what they do is both of the people who kind of take this religion, and again, I'm not saying Muhammad and Jesus, but the people who begin to spread this religion use it as a way to create cultural spread as well. And they use it as a way to dominate economies. They use it as a way to dominate cultures. So this spread of Islam happens all throughout Southwest Asia, and it happens with the Arab invaders. Just like European colonists used it in other parts of the world to create cultural homogeny, people in Southwest Asia who were Islamic used it to create cultural and economic homogeny. That means making it basically all the same throughout here. And that way they increase their economic domination, their political domination. Now there's a really important part of Islam that goes along with this cultural and economic domination that I'm going to get into in just a minute. But just so you can see all of the stuff on here, when we talk about Islamization, we're talking about the spread of Islam. I have a map of war. Let me see if I can bring it up. Nope, now you can see all the stuff that I'm doing. Let's see if we can, oh, come on. Sorry, bear with me. Nope, this is not what we want. Just show it. All right, that's not working. and I have no idea how to edit that out, so you're going to see it. But I will post this map, this interactive map that shows you the spread of religion through the world, but pay special attention to how the spread of religion has a lot to do with dominating Southwest Asia. Okay, eventually it expands into Europe. That expands with the Ottoman Empire, the Moors, into Russia. Basically, it expands with cultural and economic expansion. Uh, and yeah, so watch this interactive map, please. So it expands all through here, and it's used, like I said, as a way to control economy, as a way to control um, transportation. So let's understand the basic ideas of Islam because that's going to be important in understanding the culture. So Islam, first of all, is not a religion that you can go about lightly. It's not a religion where you're like, yeah, I'm kind of Islamic, I'm kind of Buddhist, I'm kind of, a little bit pagan. It's an all or nothing kind of faith. So the first thing that happens is the expression of the basic creed. So the Shahada. The Shahada is essentially, if you're Christian, the first step you have to take as a Christian is to accept Jesus as your savior, as your personal savior, right? And then baptism comes and all kinds of other stuff comes after that. But just like in Christianity, there's the basic step of, okay, I'm accepting Islam. And that's the transition where you become a Muslim, a person. So a Muslim is a person, right? And what you're doing is you are accepting the basic tenet of Islam. And the basic tenet, the basic belief is that we live in a world created by Allah, that Allah um, can see us all the time. He's omniscient. He's not a he actually. In Islam, Allah doesn't take a form and doesn't actually have a gender. So Allah, we live in a world that Allah created. Allah can see us all the time, knows everything, is all powerful, all of that. Same idea behind Christianity is that we live in this universe that was created in 7 days. It's the same story between Islam and Judaism and Christianity because they all start in the same place with Abraham. So after we have submitted ourselves to Islam, and by the way, that's what that word means. Islam translates into English either as submission, so submission, meaning I submit to Allah, but it also can translate as love. And if you think about those words, they seem very different in our culture, love and submission, but they're actually pretty similar in the concept, how they play out. If you love something, then you have submitted to its will, essentially. I could talk to you about how I love my daughter, who I do. And loving her means submitting to what's best for her. And that's not always what's best for me personally, right? So, with that idea of love and submission being basically the same thing, think about that in terms of submitting to a faith. If I'm submitting to a faith, I'm submitting to trust Allah. And there's a great way of explaining this when it comes to going back to Abraham. So, if we go back here to Abraham, and this would be Ishmael, and this would be Isaac over here. So, there's a story in the Torah and the Quran and the Bible that has to do with Abraham and his faith. So God tells him he has to sacrifice his oldest son. Now his oldest son, depending on who you are, is going to change. In Judaism and in Christianity, because Sarah is the wife, this is considered his oldest son because he's the quote unquote legitimate son. But Hagar was his concubine. So, and this is his oldest son. So in Islam, the story goes that it was Ishmael that he took to the altar. So God tells Abraham he has to take his oldest son and sacrifice him, kill him, basically. And so in Judaism and in Christianity, they believe that it's Jacob. In Islam, they believe that that's Ishmael. Now, the difference in the story is that Jacob is blindfolded. He doesn't know what's happening. Not Jacob, sorry, Isaac. Isaac is blindfolded. And Isaac doesn't know what's happening. And that's the idea of blind faith, right? The idea that you have that you are blindly faithful in what is best for you. But over here in the Islamic story, Ishmael went willingly. He heard that God had said to Abraham, "You have to take your oldest son and sacrifice him." And he offered himself up. And that is the fundamental idea of, of submission, is submitting yourself to Allah's will, even if it means sacrificing yourself. So now we have made the Shahada, and we commit to praying every day. Now, depending on which sect of Islam you're in, because just like with Christianity, where you have Catholicism, you have Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, you have Lutherans. Just like in Judaism, where you have Reform Jews, you have Orthodox Jews, Islam has different sects as well. And the most famous sects, or the most well-known sects, are Sunni and Shia, which I'm sure are terms that you've heard before. So depending on which sect of Islam you're in, you pray 3 times a day or pray 5 times a day. You pray at certain times of the day. If we were in an Islamic country, this is part of a mosque. This is the minaret on the side of a mosque, and this is where the call to prayer happens. We would hear the call to prayer at different times of the day, and we would face Mecca. Mecca is, guess what? The place that Muhammad met the angel Gabriel and began to write the Quran. So we would do our call to prayer, we would pray. We'd pray on a mat. While we're doing that, we would bow down and we would sit up and bow down. Again, remember, we're submitting to Allah. Okay, and then we commit to Ramadan. That is fasting for the light hours, basically like when the sun is up, for a month out of every year. And the reason that you're doing that is, again, to show your submission, to show your commitment. You're doing it because, it's a relationship between you and God. God can see you at all times. Allah can see you at all times. So this is showing your commitment to that submission. But at the same time, remember we talked about how religions can control you, and sometimes that control can be a good thing. That control can create order, like by telling people not to murder each other. Well, the religions that come from Southwest Asia all have an element of fasting. In Judaism, on Yom Kippur, we don't eat for 25 hours. In Islam, you don't eat during the daylight in Ramadan. And it probably had to do with rat infestations. I'm not trying, again, to take away the whole process of spirituality, but there's a lot of practical reasons for why we do things in religion, and some of them are good practical reasons. For example, if you're Jewish or if you're Islamic, then you circumcise your sons. You cut off the foreskin of the penis. And you do that because it's supposed to show that you're part of the covenant of Abraham. But, the practical reason at the time in Southwest Asia would have been that extra foreskin was giving people a lot of yeast infections. And yeast infections meant infertility and possibly death at a time when you needed to grow your numbers. Remember, this was about clan identity. So while I could tell you to cut off part of your penis because it was going to make you healthier, you're still going to have to cut off part of your penis. And who wants to do that, right? You can all raise your hands at home. But if I tell you that God said, well, that's a whole different story. And it's interesting the way the psychology of humanity works, where like we can be presented with facts and figures, and we're still like, no, I'm not going to cut off part of my penis, even though I know infertility and blah, blah, blah. But then when I'm like, well, God told me to do it, then suddenly that becomes the bigger factor. Okay, so in Ramadan and in Yom Kippur, it was probably because rats were infesting our pantries. So we had to clear them out for a period of time. And again, you can tell people like there's rats and they're coming to get you, so clear out your pantry. Or you can tell them God said. And for some reason, we respond more to God said. Giving of alms. This is charity, and this is something that is important to, again, all three of these Abrahamic religions. Now, giving of charity is a real thing. It doesn't mean giving away the stuff that you don't want around your house. Like, for example, my Girl Scouts do a food drive every year, and every year people give them expired food, and they somehow have told themselves that by giving Girl Scouts trash to take out, that that's somehow charity. But that's not charity. That's just you making your trash somebody else's trash. Charity is where you give something that you actually need. And now, again, when we're thinking about how I said that Islam was all about a cultural response to the area that it developed, keep that in mind. Things like Ramadan, things like praying daily, um, things like the giving of alms. They were all there to strengthen the community. So I'm going to come back to that in just a minute. And then the last part is the Hajj. And the Hajj is a trip that you take, a pilgrimage that you take to Mecca at least once in your life, and you commit to do that. Every able bodied Islamic person, every able bodied, so men and women, need to go to Mecca at least once in their life. And once they do that, they're referred to as a Hajj or a Haji. Sorry, they're referred to as a Haji if they've gone on their Hajj. And this this Hajj is something that's very important that I'll come back to in just a minute as well. So some other things about Islam. You're not supposed to drink alcohol. You're not supposed to smoke. You're not supposed to gamble. You're not supposed to get tattooed. These aren't necessarily enforced. They're not part of the 5 pillars, but they're strongly recommended. They're things that you're not supposed to do. And then they tolerate polygamy, which means you can have more than one wife, but they would rather you commit to monogamy. I'm going to come back to that in just a minute. Looking at all these pillars and these precepts, these important parts of Islam, they all have to do with creating a strong society. And this is the cultural response. Okay, remember, this is an area that people tried to control for trade for a long time. One thing that you can do in response to that is what happened in Southeast Asia. Down here in Southeast Asia, this is an area that people wanted to control for a long time too. Look at it. It's an area that's good for trade because of water and because of access to much larger land masses. So people have colonized and controlled this part of Southwest Asia for a very long time. And their response was Buddhism. In Buddhism, you accept that the world is going to happen around you and you can only control your response to it. You can't control the world, you can only control your response to it. So their reaction, their cultural reaction to being constantly controlled was to develop this cultural idea that you can't control the world, you can only control your reaction. Over here, you had this cultural reaction to people constantly trying to take control of your land because of trade. The response was, let's create as bulletproof a culture as possible. Let's create a culture where we follow these rules, where we don't smoke, we don't drink, we don't do things to hurt our blood like tattooing. Not the tattoos of today, tattoos back in the day that would have poisoned your blood and hurt your kidney. Let's make sure that all the people in our community are taken care of. It's our duty to make sure that nobody is starving, that everybody has, that charity is just a part of our daily life. Let's show our commitment. If that makes sense to you, that basically if you live in an area that people want to control, you try to create a culture that is so structured that you're less vulnerable. Basically, the more structure I can create and the stronger I can make my people, if they're running around gambling and drunk all the time, well, then we're vulnerable. People are going to come in and try to control us. But if we have a culture, if we have this cultural ideology that keeps us healthy and keeps us united and taken care of, well, maybe we're less vulnerable. So that's why I wanted you guys to really understand Islam, because at its foundation, it was a reaction to being controlled through because of trade and all that stuff that I keep talking about. Okay. Excuse me. The Hajj. I want to come back to the Hajj. Remember, that is the pilgrimage that you commit to do at least one time in your life. So the Hajj is several days. So it's 5 to 6 days. It happens at a certain time. It's not just any time. You can't just go to Mecca, which is in Saudi Arabia, at any point. It happens between the 8th and the 12th of the last month of the Islamic calendar. So that's why it changes within the year. That's also why Ramadan isn't the same every year. And there's a couple of very important things that happen. Okay, so first you go to the house of God. And so Islamic people don't believe that God is here or anything like this. They believe that this is where Adam and Eve found each other after they were cast out of Eden. This is also the area that Muhammad would have been writing the Quran, not right here, but this greater area in Mecca. Okay, so you have the whole idea of Adam and Eve here. But what I want you to pay attention to is that a lot of the things that you do on your Hajj have to do with Hagar. So the Zamzam well, that's where God showed Hagar and Ishmael after they had been cast out and they were wandering out in the middle of, the Arabian desert. God showed them water. Hagar needed to find she needed to find food for her son. So there are these two mountains basically that you run in between while you're on your Hajj, and that's because she would have left Ishmael at the top of one mountain, and then she would have run in the valley, and she could see him when she was at the peak of another mountain when she was searching for food. But she would have run through the valley so that he wasn't out of her sight for very long. That's part of the Hajj as well, is that there's this one day where people are basically like running back and forth in this valley. It's because they're paying homage to what Hagar would have done. And then a lot of these other things have to do with Abraham. Abraham, for example, was tempted by the devil. You throw rocks at these three pillars that are supposed to, symbolize the devil and Abraham's struggle a very long time ago. But I really want you to pay attention to how several of these things have specifically to do with Hagar. I'll come back to what that is in just a minute. And that's because gender plays a huge role in this region, and people tend to think of Islam as somehow being a religion that doesn't like women, or that is, sexist or misogynist or something like that. And I want to make the point that this is a religion that is focused on Hagar. That essentially Muhammad, what he was doing is he wrote in the Quran a whole series of laws that protected women. And if we look at those laws today, they have to do with marriage, they have to do with inheritance, they have to do with divorce. By today's guidelines, they're archaic. But back in the 7th century, when Muhammad was writing the Quran and he begins Islamic law, he writes women into it because in his thinking, Hagar would have been protected if these laws had been set in place. They wouldn't have been able to kick her out, and she wouldn't have wandered the Arabian desert and only survived because God helped her if she'd been protected in society. So when Muhammad writes the Quran, he bases a whole lot of it around protecting this woman and thus protecting all women in the area. At the time, women didn't have a right to a marriage contract. They didn't have a right to inheritance. They didn't inherit anything. So their economic well-being was based on who they married. So they didn't inherit anything from their dad. They weren't allowed to divorce. And that was true in Europe, that was true in East Asia. So when Muhammad begins Islamic law, he actually creates the very first women's rights movement. And I know that that sounds counterintuitive to people who think that Islam is this religion that is misogynist, but it actually is a religion that sets up protections for women. It's just that those laws haven't really changed in the last 700 years. So women are allowed a marriage contract, meaning that they have to agree to who they're marrying. Before that, They basically were just sold off by their fathers into marriage. Um, they they are allowed inheritance. Now they're given half of what their brothers are given, and by today's standards, if we look at that in Islamic law, we're like, that's sexist. Half of what your brother gets isn't, that's not right. But back in the day when they received no inheritance, this was a huge step forward. And think about how we try to change laws today. How long did it take us to get same sex marriage to be legal? Today, same sex marriage is legal in the US, but think about how long it took to convince people and how we had to do little steps at first, like civil unions and stuff like that. This was kind of the equivalent of baby steps, but that was on the road to giving women full rights. And also women were allowed to divorce. Now, in Islamic law, they have to get their husband's permission for a divorce, but they were given no rights to divorce before that. So again, it was a step in a direction that Muhammad was trying to attempt to give people full rights. Now, if we look at the covering, for example, all of the religions that come from this region require women to be covered. It's just that those religions don't follow it anymore. Like Judaism, women are required to be covered in Judaism as well, but just nobody follows that idea in Judaism anymore. It's the same thing in Christianity, and it has everything to do with the environment. If you look at this area around Southwest Asia, covering yourself was protecting yourself from the sun. So, again, if we look at the way that religion creates cultural control that can sometimes help us, the covering of women in this area, in a lot of ways, I mean, men had to be covered as well. It's not just women, they just don't have to be as covered as women. In a lot of ways, it was a reaction to what the landscape looked like. Now, a lot of the things that we see in Islam today that we think of as misogynist or as sexist have to do with they have to do with the cultures that would have been in this region to begin with. So when we look at some of the things that we think the things that we think of as sexist and the things that might be justified by horrible regimes like the Saudi Arabian monarchy or ISIS here or the Taliban here, those have everything to do um, with customs that would have been in place before Islam. So before Islam, you would have had very misogynist societies. And when Islam becomes the dominant religion in this area, the laws of Islam get kind of warped, just like anything. Just like when we talked about South America and how Catholicism was introduced to South America, but little parts of pre-colonial cultures make their way through, like with the heart, with the Sacred Heart, or with like the focus on the Virgin Mary. Those are things, if you remember, have to do with the cultures that existed before Catholicism in South America. Not like Roman Catholicism in South America wasn't introduced by, I mean, sorry, Mary wasn't introduced by Roman Catholicism in South America. It was more like there were matriarchal societies, and this new religion was being introduced to the Aztec and to the Inca, and they focused on Mary because that was something they recognized in their culture. Well, so you would have had the same things here. Unfortunately, they would have been extremely misogynist. So a lot of the very misogynist things that we see that have kind of like been adopted into Islam today were parts of the cultures beforehand. And if you need proof of that, you can just look at how the Kaaba, what happens here, everybody in this area is going to be male and female. So if you look at the restrictions on women in public space or driving or being alone with people who aren't members of their family, there's restrictions like that in countries in Southwest Asia today, and people say, oh, it's Islamic. It's actually not Islamic, because if you look at the holiest place in Islam, men and women are walking around together. Those restrictions have to do with pre-Islamic cultures, and they've just kind of seeped into Islamic practice today, if that makes sense to you. So Wahhabism, that is a sect of Islam. It is a very small sect. It's only about 5% of Islamic people. And it's it's an example of of how Wahhabism is really the culture of pre-Islamic Arabia that has just been repackaged as Islam. So it's a culture, it's a sect of Islam that has like huge restrictions on women, that has like it's it's if you think about it as puritanical, it's extremely puritanical. And when Saudi Arabia became a country, so remember, Arabia was part of the Ottoman Empire, and then the Saudi, I talked about this the other day, the Saudi family is the family that becomes the monarchy that controls and basically names the entire country after themselves. Um, so what they did is they took an existing group of Bedouins, those people that I said would have lived here for a very long time and would have lived in Southwest Asia, basically in like little groups of people with very tribal identities. What would have happened is when the Saudi family came in here, they used those Bedouins who had this really strict interpretation of Islam, which really isn't Islam at all. It's the faith that would have existed here beforehand that has, like I said, been repackaged into this Wahhabist version of Islam. So the Saudi family used these Wahhabist Bedouins in this part of the world, and they basically said, if you control this peninsula, then you can be our national guard and you can have an entire country based on your Wahhabist Islamic identity, as long as you allow us, the Saudi family, to stay in control of this area. So we talked about this in Iran, how Iran was a a place that had been a civilization for a long time, the Persian Empire for a long time, and then the Shah was this small, not small, but was this private who was used by the West basically to control the country. Well, the Saudi government was the same. The Saudi government was a group of people who were willing to do business with the West. They took this group of of Bedouins who were Wahhabist, and they made them the National Guard. And what they did is they created this country of extremely strict rules, extreme oppression, but they're very, very wealthy, and they have remained in control of the Arabian Peninsula for so long because there's a lot of oil in Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia does business with the West, and as long as they're Western friendly, well, then they're going to run their government the way they're going to run their government, if that makes sense. And this story, we can replicate the same story over and over and over again through Southwest Asia. Like we looked at the other day, that map that showed independence after colonization. So you had the Ottoman Empire break apart in World War I, and then you had these countries colonized by different European countries for a short period of time, and then they become independent nations. And they're independent, but they basically all have a system of puppet governments. The Shah here, the Saudi family here, um, uh, that do business with the West but keep their populations pretty oppressed, which is one of the reasons that a lot of these places have also had a whole lot of military um, and they've had a lot of what am I trying to say? They've had a lot of like revolutionary upheaval with the Iranian Revolution here in 1979, which we read about, or what's happening in Syria, or what's happened in Iraq in recent years, all through this region. You have the result of an area that was colonized, an area that became independent, but the people who became in control of these new countries were people who were friendly to the West, but not necessarily friendly to their people. And then you had these people who revolt against those puppet governments. And out here in the US, we see this happening, and we don't know the whole story, and we don't know the cultural complexity or the historical complexity, and we just think, oh, there's those people going crazy again, without seeing that it's a pattern that's playing out over and over again. So let's see. So Islam. This is I had already talked about Islam, and I just want this is what I was talking about with the sects, with the Sunni. The Sunni are about 85% of Islamic people today, and Shia are just 10%. A lot of people think that this is a really like a bloody divide, but it's not a bloody divide. It was essentially after Muhammad died, some people thought that a blood relative should be the successor of Muhammad, and that was Ali, his cousin. But Muhammad actually said that his successor should be his father-in-law. So the people who followed his father-in-law as the leader, so not a prophet, but as the leader of the Islamic world, those are people who are Sunni. And the people who followed his cousin Ali, those are Shia. And then you have a very small percentage of people who are Wahhabis. That's what we just talked about in Saudi Arabia. And then Sufi, again, that's only about 3% of Muslims in the world. And those 3% are basically, these are basically the philosophers of Islam. These are the people who study the religion and aren't so concerned with the cultural aspect. Okay, so let's talk about the conflict in this area. So the conflict in this area, if we're looking at again, this is the Silk Road, and then this is the spice route that develops later. That's boats. But if we're looking at more recent history and the conflict that's developed, it has everything to do with oil, and it has to do with controlling oil. So let's look at Syria. Let's understand Syria, and then let's understand the Taliban. And then you're going to watch the videos like I asked you to on Syria to really understand it. And then we'll talk about Israel, and then we'll be done. And okay, so Syria, a small country, you probably know it because it's in chaos right now, is an area that was controlled for a very long time by the Ottomans. And then after World War I, it becomes an independent, well, it's not quite independent. It becomes a colony, and then it becomes an independent country. And that country has been led by the Assad family. So the Assad family, you've probably heard that name before, Assad. The Assad family, father and son, who have controlled this region. Now, a very important part of understanding this region is, like I said, understanding the history of it, understanding that oil is a big part of having puppet governments that are going to do business with the West, but keeping the population of people pretty calm, that is the real struggle. So how do you keep people calm if they have a dictator leading them? Well, one thing is if they're fed. In Saudi Arabia, people are very, very wealthy. So yes, they live under a government that is very restricting, but it takes a lot for you to be willing to sacrifice your life, sacrifice your children's lives, and overthrow governments. And if you're fed and if you're housed, it takes a while for that to really break. And in Syria, things went along just fine. And I'm not saying fine as in good, but fine as in the people didn't rebel. But then a little while ago, there was a very long drought. And this is where the issue of climate change is going to come in more and more with civil unrest in the world. Is that as long as we're fed and taken care of, we'll put up with a lot. But as climate change comes in, and for example, in Syria, you had this very long drought, what happened is the farmers who had been living under a dictator but had been surviving okay, now in this drought, they can't even survive okay. So what happens is they start to rebel because they can't grow crops, because they can't feed themselves. People are starving in the countryside, so they start to rebel. And Assad cracks down on them with no mercy. He chemically attacks his own people. He completely takes out entire villages. And this is a story that we see over and over and over again in this area. So I want you to watch that video on Syria to see kind of like how this area has developed into a proxy war. But keep in mind that this is another story of a place where it was part of the Ottoman Empire, a puppet government was put in place, people were okay for a while, environmental catastrophe came in, people started to rebel, and then they saw the face of that dictator and how he treated his own people. So going to Saudi Arabia, going back to Saudi Arabia, again with with the Saudi government controlling for a long time, they, like I said, implemented this very strict version of Islam, Wahhabism. And after a couple of generations, so this would have been right after World War II. But by the 1980s, you had people who had lived in this country for you had generations who had been born and only knew the history of the country as is. So they started to question, if they're Wahhabist, if they have this strict version of Islam, which doesn't allow for any other type of Islam. So if you're Sunni, if you're Shia, that's not exactly right, but basically, if you aren't Wahhabist, then they don't consider you Islamic. so, um, so for a while, uh, I'm sorry, so in the 1980s, what happens is you have this group of people who start to question, why is the Saudi government, who is supposed to be Wahhabist, doing business with the West? Those people are not Islamic. And you have this middle class, the beginning of this middle class rebellion. And in order to stop that rebellion, the Saudi government takes these people who are rebelling, here and sends them to Afghanistan. In the 1980s, Afghanistan, you had the USSR, and Afghanistan had moved into the USSR, and was basically the USSR had gone into Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan. They were taking over more and more. They were basically like moving their way down to South Asia. So they move into Afghanistan as a way of they're trying to control like all the way down here. And when they move into Afghanistan, for a while had been this place that was run by a king, a monarchy. It was a really nice place to live up until there was the monarch, there was a rebellion and the monarch was overthrown, and then the Soviets invade, and that's when Afghanistan really starts to go wonky and I'm sorry, that's a dismissive way of referring to it, but that's when Afghanistan's history starts to go bad in more recent history, is when the Soviets invade. So over here, the Saudi government, in order to stop these people who are starting to question them, they send them to Afghanistan. They send them on a holy war. They basically what's happening is you have this group of people who are like, hey, why are you doing business with the West? And the Saudi government's like, hey, look over there. And so they send them to Afghanistan. And in Afghanistan, they're fighting the Soviets. And then the Soviets leave eventually in the late 1980s, and there's a power vacuum. And now you have an area, and the US helped in fighting the Soviets. So they did this whole covert operation where they basically armed the people in Afghanistan to help get the Soviets out. But they did not come up with a good end game. Basically, they went in, they helped the Afghani people throw the Soviets out, and the Soviet Union was crumbling at this time anyway. But they didn't have an end game in plan. They didn't basically stay to make sure that there was a stable government afterwards. So what you had was a power vacuum, and you had a whole lot of people who were trying to control this area. You had these middle class people who had been sent over here, the Mujahideen. You had all these different small sects of society who were now battling it out, trying to control. And among these people were these Saudi middle class uh, jihadists who had been sent to fight the Soviets. And among those people was Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden was one of the middle class people here who'd been questioning why the Saudi government was doing business with the West, and he gets sent to Afghanistan. And what eventually happens is the Taliban is one of the factions in Afghanistan that's trying to control. And when the Taliban takes over, people are actually happy. People think, oh, thank God, there's an end to this civil war that we've had since the Soviets left. But the Taliban implements this cruel, horrible social order. The Taliban was nothing but a moneymaker. They were people who wanted to control the resources, who wanted to control this land. And what they did is they essentially took, and remember, this would have been an area that was controlled by the Soviets and then just wrought with civil war. So when the Taliban comes in, what they do is they create just a whole bunch of impossible laws, and they create it based on the idea that Islam is the reason they're doing it, but they are not Islamic. Being Islamic is does not mean murdering people. It doesn't mean controlling women to a degree where they can't leave their household, even if there's no man in their household. What happened is you had a whole lot of men who were killed in the Civil War, and you had women alone in their household, and they weren't allowed to leave under Taliban rule. So they starved to death, or else they left and they were beaten and arrested. Their children were taken away from them, and put in these horrible, overrun orphanages. And all of this was done because the Taliban wanted to control the population. They Now this is an area, if you remember from that map that I showed you the other day, this is an area um, that people have tried to control for a very long time because of the trade route. So you have little leftovers of the people who have controlled this area for a long time. You have little sects of people who are Mongolian. You have little sects of people who are Persian, part of the Persian Empire. You have little sects of people who are part of Turkmenistan. It's a whole like group. It's a whole country of small little groups of people. And one of the things that the Taliban did to control, and we've seen this all over the world now, is they took the Pashtuns. The Pashtuns were the majority of the population, and they basically elevated those people, and they picked on smaller sects of people like the Hazara. The Hazara are a small group of people in Afghanistan who are connected to Mongolia and the Mongolian Empire when they controlled this part of the world. And they annihilated them. They just murdered them. It was a way of gaining control of, the 60% of the population that's Pashtun. So what I'm trying to set up here is not so much a need for you to remember all these little details of the Hazara, of, the jihadists who were sent from here. It's so that you can see a greater pattern that's happening in this area. With Assad in Syria, with the Saudi government here, with the Taliban here, with the Shah here, so much of it is. So the Taliban wasn't ever backed by the US, but the Shah was, the Saudi government was, Assad. All of these people were people who controlled the population in order to keep resources coming out of this area and going to the West. And eventually people started to rebel, either because they were being tightly controlled, either because they ran into a drought and they couldn't feed themselves, because they were being invaded by other groups of people. We start to see rebellion in this area, and then we start to see the West get involved again. And in Iran, for example, we saw in Persepolis that the people rebelled against the Shah, and so the US arms Iraq. And then in a few years, Iraq is who we're fighting, and over and over and over again. So the story that I want you to see in this area is a story of chaos. That's the story we know. We know the narrative of chaos, but I want you to understand how that chaos started, and that it's not a factor of the people who live there. It's not that the people who live here are inherently chaotic. It's a factor of location, of resources, oil, and of history. And it's what happens when we try to divide people in order to control their resources. So, that was a lot, and I want you to please watch the videos on Syria that I've posted. Real quick, the Yazidi people, that's another group, that's another small ethnic religion. I just want to bring light to them because we often think about Judaism, or we know about Judaism, but Judaism is an example, like I said, of an ancient ethnic religion. There's other ancient ethnic religions that still exist. The Yazidi are some of them. And if you watch that video on Syria, it'll talk about ISIS and the development of ISIS. ISIS, like the Taliban, was a group that developed to control populations, and they did it with under the guise of Islam, but it has nothing to do with Islam. It has to do with making money. It has to do with controlling the resources of Syria and the part of Iraq that they control. And one of the ways that they make money is from the Yazidi. The Yazidi is an ethnic religion. It has existed for a very long time. It goes back to like the period of Abraham. in creating ethnic identity through religion and stuff like that. It has little pieces of it look like Christianity, little pieces of it look like Islam, little pieces of it look like religions that would have existed before those monotheist religions. But ISIS has just gone into the 2 million Yazidi people and either used their men for military or killed them, or and then used their women and sold them into sex slavery. And like I said, this is not an Islamic organization. Even though ISIS calls themselves Islamic and other people call them Islamic, in no way was Islam ever about taking a group of women and selling them into sex slavery, because they're not Islamic. So, so let's talk about Israel real fast. And I'm sorry because I'm pretty sure that I'm running on. There's a video that I posted on Israel on Canvas, and I want you to watch it. But Israel is just another example. It is just, oh shoot, it is just another example of how this area is a place that we've tried to control. And this is a different way that we've tried to control it. So not quite through a puppet government, but through a Western-friendly government. Now their shtick, not to be punny or anything, but their shtick was more about returning Jewish people to their homeland. So Israel becomes a country after World War II, and it's kind of the perfect timing. You have Jewish people who are like, hey, if we'd had a homeland to go home to, then we wouldn't have been annihilated by Hitler. So so what happens, just a basis of what happens, is you have, this is before Israel starts. And so Palestinian people are Arabic people, but they're Palestinian people as well. And this area would have been part of the Ottoman Empire, which is why the argument of who this belongs to, etc., etc., isn't super relevant, because all of this area would have, quote unquote, belonged to the Ottomans. So if we look at the question today of like, does Israel have the right to exist? Do Palestinians have the right to exist? Of course they do. They all do. It's not so much about how long people have been there or who is rightful owners to the land. It's that everybody has been here for a very long time. Okay, so after World War II, you have Jewish people who want their own homeland for understandable reasons after Hitler and the Holocaust. And then you also have the factor of the West attempting to control as much of Southwest Asia as possible. And this was just another way for them to have a Western-friendly government in place. And it's perfect because it's right here on the Mediterranean. So this is the beginning. This is Palestinian land, and this would have been Israel. And Israel, since like it started as a country, went from this size and continues to expand and continues to expand. And that's the real drama with Israel today, is that now Israel is expanding because of resources. I mean, look at this. This is a very fractured country, and this would have been and this is basically all very dry. There's not a whole lot happening down here when it comes to ability to, I mean, the Israeli people have definitely created aqueducts and they've made this a much more fertile land, but this is a really dry area. This is what you want up here. This is where the water is. So their expansion has been because of resources. But remember, when they expand into resources for themselves, they're taking resources from somebody else. For example, they take part of Syria in what are called the Golan Heights in the late 1960s. And that's because there's a lot of water and a lot of fertile land here. 30% of the water that Israel uses and a whole lot of the agriculture comes from the Golan Heights. So when we look at this, it was strategic. Now we bring it back to the argument of culture and Judaism and stuff like that, but it has everything to do with who controls the resources in this area. And so the last thing that I'll say about this is what's happening is in this Palestinian land, this is the controversy over the idea of settlements. And what's happening is you have people who are going into, you have Israeli communities that are moving into Palestinian land. And now Israel's not supposed to move in here, but you have these, they're kind of like gigantic condo settlements that are coming into, they're like, if you imagine Orange County, that's what this is looking a whole lot like today, where you have these separated settlements that are being built by Israeli contractors, not by the government. And then Israeli people move in there. And a lot of those people are being supported by American Christians, which is a whole other interesting side story. That you have American Christians who believe that we need to get Muslims out of this area before Jesus is going to come back again. It's a whole other side story. So what happens is you have people who live in this area. A lot of those people are getting money from American organizations, not the country, but from American organizations. And then if Palestinians attack them, the Israeli government has to go in and protect them. See the way that works? Is that essentially you have Israeli people move in here, and then and not the government, but people, and then you have the Palestinian people attack, and you have the Israeli government protecting them. And that's the conflict. And if you remember when we talked about North America, that is the exact situation that happened with US settlers going into Native American land in the 1890s. If you remember me talking about Little House on the Prairie days, and the Irish immigrants and the European immigrants who were settling, quote unquote, Oklahoma and places like that, and the Native American people would attack them, and then the American government had to protect them. And it was a way of basically expanding without the country actually expanding. So that's where I'm going to stop. I know that that was a lot of information, but I hope that it helped you understand this region a little bit more. Please watch the videos, and your midterm will be up on Thursday. And I'm available on FaceTime, Skype, all that stuff. All right, signing off, not with that. How do I stop this?